And joining me today, who just came back from a trip to China, is Congressman Darin Lahood. Thank you so much for being here today.
Eugene, thanks for having me on.
First, I want to ask you, what did you learn? I mean, we know within the last year, the tariff war between U.S. and China has really, in a lot of ways, been detrimental for farmers in the Midwest, particularly soybeans, et cetera. So what did you take away from your recent trip to China?
Well, I was proud to lead a bipartisan group of members of Congress to China to talk specifically about trade. And listen, Eugene, I'm not a fan of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes. They're taxes on our consumers. They've hurt our farmers. But really, our message to the Chinese when we were there is a couple things. One is, for 25 years, the Chinese have been ripping us off and not abiding by the trade agreements we've had in place in the past. So getting them to comply, getting them to abide by the rules that we abide by and every other industrialized country does. That was the first point. Second was, we're a united front. Republicans and Democrats went over there to let them know we need to have a different approach when it comes to trade agreements. Now, you're right. Our farmers are hurting. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress out there because of the retaliation. But we need to change the way that China plays in the trade game. They have to change their behavior. And I give President Trump credit for using these tariffs in a narrow way to bring the Chinese to the table because our two economies are intertwined. They're both very important. We need those customers. We need that market share over there. 25% of our corn and soybeans grown in this country goes to China. Caterpillar has 29 manufacturing plants in China, 4 R&D facilities. So it's important to our district to get that worked out. What our message was, we produce the best products, whether it's Caterpillar tractors, whether it's corn and soybean, whether it's ethanol. But we have to have the Chinese playing by the same set of rules. And so that was our message at the highest level. And I'm happy that Trump's trade ambassador and Secretary Mnuchin are there this week. I just talked to them before they left. So I'm cautiously optimistic we can get a trade deal done long term.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, they were at the table on Thursday as well talking. So for people who aren't able to be a part of those discussions, who aren't able to take that trip, obviously, to China and kind of get that understanding, what has changed? You mentioned that, China is now coming to the table. So what has changed? What specifically has changed in China's negotiations that has given you a little bit more of an ease as far as the process right now? What has changed?
I think a couple things. I think they know President Trump isn't bluffing when it comes to the tariffs. I think if you look at the last 25 years, from President Clinton to President Bush to President Obama, they've all talked a big game with China, but in the end, we didn't get the enforcement mechanism or didn't get China to abide by things. I think that's a different approach now. You also have, I think, much more of an adversarial approach to China than we've had in the past, that we're kind of sick and tired of them stealing our intellectual property. The cyber theft that's going on, the forced technology transfers. I mean, technology is the future, Eugene, and China wants to lead that, and right now we do that. So we're trying to get them to change their behavior, and really that's our message. And in Congress now we have, again, Republicans and Democrats, and for a long time we used to have kind of 3 separate groups that were opposed to China. You had the security hawks, you had the human rights hawks, and you had the economic hawks. Well, they've all been united now going after China, and that was really our message. So I think that's changed, and I think that's brought the Chinese to the table. Obviously, they have a huge country. They have internal problems they have to change, but their economy has been affected by the tariffs. Their stock market has slowed down. They are feeling the pressure there. Hopefully that will be the impetus to get them to change their behavior.
How long do you think that this can continue? Because you mentioned it. I mean, it's the duality. On one end, you're saying that you see that they now understand that President Trump isn't bluffing and the impact that his plan is having. But on the other hand, you also acknowledge that it is right now putting a clamp and hurting farmers within the Midwest and particularly companies within the Midwest who do business with China. So how long can this continue in that process to get the desired goal?
Yeah, well, I'm glad we're having negotiations. We did our trip last week. The president's folks are there this week. Next week, the lead China negotiator comes to Washington, D.C. That's very important. I'm cautiously optimistic, Eugene, that these talks will result in an agreement. And then really what will be the most important is the enforcement mechanism moving forward and making sure the Chinese abide by that enforcement mechanism. But I would think that by June, eventually we could have President Xi of China and President Trump get together here in the United States and reach an agreement. It is in our best interest to do that. I don't want to be in a trade war a year from now or 2 years from now. It's not good for our economy. So hopefully these talks will result in a solution to the trade deal. I think it's on the table. It's just getting each to abide by that. And the last point I would make, Eugene, is there's lots of people around the world watching this. Our European allies are watching because they have the same problems with China. Japan does, Korea does. Again, getting China to play by the same rules. If they want to be a first world country, they have to abide by the same rules that we all do.
Okay. How long in this, well, I'll backtrack a little bit. You said that you wouldn't want to be in this situation a year, 2 years from now. But what if a year, 2 years from now, in a scenario that China doesn't budge, would you say that we should back out of the approach that we're going right now, or do you continue and wait until they actually make a decision to budge into what we're trying to get done?
Well, I think we got to forge ahead with our negotiations now. I think we're in a good position. I think we have good leverage. I think it's, again, in both countries' interest to get this resolved. I have a lot of confidence in Ambassador Lighthizer, our trade negotiator. He's been through these in the past, Secretary Mnuchin. So I have confidence that we can reach an agreement. And so let's see how these talks go. And if those don't work, I think then we can make a decision on tariffs. But again, tariffs long-term are not good for our country. It's not good for my district. And I'm going to continue to advocate for reaching a resolution.
And my last question regarding that to you is, I'm sure you're talking to your constituents. What are you telling to them as maybe some of them are trying to hang on throughout this process? What are your words for people who are being impacted by this day in and day out?
Well, listen, I come back to my district every single weekend. I meet with farmers all the time because it's an important constituency, and I've been a strong advocate. But when I talk to my farmers, they may be hurting, they may have a lot of anxiety, but they generally support the president in going after China. We're sick and tired of being ripped off and being, in a lot of ways on the technology side, being abused by China and not playing by those same rules. So I think they realize that if we can reach an agreement and make this trade agreement strong and go after the Chinese, that's going to be good for all of us. It's good for our economy. It's good for ag overall. And so I've been telling them, that I'm cautiously optimistic and I understand their concerns. And I expressed that when I was over in China, that I have a heavy ag district, but my farmers support the president and where we're at with these negotiations now.
All right, a little bit of a different, but still within ag. The Peoria AG Lab is now off the docket to be, to not receive funding. It will receive its funding at this point. You and Congresswoman Bustos applauded that decision as well. That's a huge thing for the Peoria area.
It really is. Yeah, we worked in a bipartisan way to make sure that is off the closure list, worked with the Trump administration to really advocate for the wonderful work that goes on at the Ag Lab. Frankly, Eugene, we haven't talked enough or marketed the Ag Lab enough, but the work that the scientists do there, the PhDs, the researchers there, they do tremendous work on food safety, on everything related to agribusiness, and keeping that off the closure list is good for Peoria. Now we need to add jobs there. There's 200 jobs that should be there. Right now we're short about 20. So our message now is to USDA, let's fill those jobs. Let's get a director in there and let's begin to promote and market what the Ag Lab does. We're right in the center of ag country here, and that Ag Lab is pivotal to our ag economy. So it's good news for Peoria, and long term it'll be good news for the country and for agriculture in general.
All right. Well, Congressman Darin Lahood, as always, thank you so much for being here today.